So I'll talk a bit about Professor Sama's paper, which I think is really excellent. He has, I think, three different ambitions for the paper. One is to introduce tie-breaking as a way of structuring sources of decision and relate tie-breaking to construction zones, which of course is particularly interesting to originalists. Second, to describe tie-breaking in many areas of law. And third, to offer some explanations for why we don't see tie-breaking structure as much in federal constitutional law as we do in these other areas. So I think the paper is mostly successful in much of what it tries to achieve. But given this is an originalism conference, I want to begin to talk about its relation to originalism. First, unlike Professor Sama, I think we may see some tiebreakers emerging in federal constitutional law as the court becomes more originalist. Second, I also want to raise some questions about the notions of decisiveness, where Professor Sama suggests that an inclusive use of sources will not necessarily be as decisive as a tie-breaking structure. And third, I want to end by suggesting that, considered on his own terms, I think there is an important additional reason we are not likely as much to see tie-breaking in federal constitutional law as in other areas of law. So one way I think of understanding Professor Sama's paper in the context of originalism is that he's observing that the Supreme Court doesn't follow the strict lexical ordering that originalist scholars suggest. That is, putting meaning before other consideration and relegating matters in the construction zone to the second tier. And I think he's certainly right that currently the court majority is not doing so with respect to precedent and meaning. But I believe that Professor Sama may face more of a challenge to his thesis about the lack of tie-breaking when it comes to the current court and other materials. The contemporary court does seem to be moving towards relegating materials unrelated to meaning to the second tier, and thus provide a lexical ordering that puts considerations of meaning first. For instance, in Noel Canning, even Justice Breyer, that notorious pragmatist, concedes that when the text is clear, subsequent practice cannot trump it. Whenever one thinks of its soundness as a matter of interpretation, that's the position in Schiaffolo as well. Heller, too, seems to reflect in both the majority and principal dissent a view that policy considerations should be relegated to the second tier, and if oral argument is an indication, that'll be a view of the majority in Bruin as well. If the court is now moving to more of a consistent tie-breaking structure and subordinating such matters unrelated to meaning, such as post-enactment practice, it's certainly conceivable we might even move to that position in precedent as well. Clarence Thomas suggests that in Gamble, where he prioritizes meaning over precedent unless the text is ambiguous. The larger point bearing on Professor Sama's thesis, I think, is that the prevalence and the nature of tie-breaking on the Supreme Court may be more historically contingent. It may tell us as much about the changing nature of jurisprudence than something inherent about the structure of federal constitutional law. Indeed, even the high stakes, which Professor Sama points out, of federal constitutional law may make changing styles of jurisprudence and politics more important. But I think Professor Sama's insights about the absence of tiebreakers may have more bite when applied to another aspect of originalism, materials that bear on fixing historical meaning. Determining original meaning itself may demand multiple sources: the specific words of the Constitution, its structure, dictionaries, historical context, legal canons, the Federalist Papers. The list could just go on. With respect to these sources, the court does not generally apply tiebreakers, but is more inclusive. And some originalist scholars, many, are similarly inclusive. But here, too, we may have a divergence between the court and some other originalist scholars. But here the divergence is in the other direction. The court is inclusive, but there are some scholars who exclude or demote some considerations that may be related to meaning, like purpose, to the second tier. I think Professor Sama is, expressly doubtful about whether there are good reasons for such a strict lexical ordering. Nevertheless, it's possible that some forms of originalism have the ability to apply lexical priority to sources related to meaning. For instance, original methods espoused by Mike Rappaport and me, or original law originalism. suggest a conventional hierarchy that may make some sources only tiebreakers and rule out other sources. In short, convention can be a source of hierarchy and exclusion even within a wholly positivist inquiry. But even if there were no such inquiry, I must say I'm a little doubtful of Professor Sama's claim that an inclusive use of sources necessarily makes inclusivity only middling in decisiveness as compared to the high decisiveness that comes from tiebreakers. To be sure, the more moving parts in a legal analysis, the more people may disagree, but disagreement is not the same as indecisiveness, just as disagreement is not necessarily a mark of indeterminacy. It might be thought that a tiebreaker is necessarily more decisive because it can cleanly break ties. And that might be true in cases where the first-tier sources are absolutely in equipoise. But the importance of such equipoise is, to my mind, a generally unjustified assumption about the nature of interpretation. Even if the case is close on the first tier, sources at least where one side is more likely to be a little better than the other when all the first-tier sources are exhausted. For instance, the meaning of a legal term, considered on its own, may point in one direction and be more compelling than a contrary structural argument considered in context, pointing to the other. And so what happens when we think about, even if it doesn't become clear at the first-tier stage, going forward to the second stage? It seems to me unjustified to ignore the advantage in the first tier when we go on to consider second-tier sources. But if we don't ignore that advantage, a tie-breaking structure starts to become harder to distinguish from an inclusivity structure. In any event, I think it's possible to have a decision rule that makes an inclusive use of sources decisive as well. For instance, if jurists should follow the best interpretation of a provision, there's not necessarily a problem with determining meaning, even if we must triangulate from many different kinds of evidence. Consider this analogy. At a trial to figure out who caused an accident, all kinds of very different evidence can be introduced, evidence that is of completely different categories: eyewitness testimony, policy reports, data, expert testimony. Jurors triangulate, I think, without a formal structure of tiebreakers. Yet it is a decisive procedure because the jurors only apply a preponderance of the evidence rule to come to their decision. Inclusive originalist materials related to meaning might be decisive under similar decision rules. So let me end on this note. Considered on the terms of his own theory, I think Professor Sama sells short his own explanation. He didn't really discuss this in his talk, but his own explanation, which I think is a very interesting one, why we don't see tiebreakers in federal constitutional law, is because there are much higher stakes in federal constitutional law. And I think that's a very interesting and plausible explanation on his own terms of his theory. But I think he may sell this explanation a little short. I don't think it's a problem that judges don't articulate this structure. Judges are often not very explicit about the deep reasons for their methodology and their opinions. And indeed, in other areas of law, much of law and economics explanations of legal rules explain patterns of decisions without asserting a pervasive economic consciousness among jurists. I would note as well that Professor Sama's high-stakes explanations, I think, has resonance, because we may see it working elsewhere in the law. There's a much more categorical rule of stare decisis in statutory than in constitutional cases. But I'd like to propose for Professor Sama's consideration one other explanation, it's an alternate explanation, it's an added explanation. Many things can have more than one explanation for the difference between federal constitutional cases and others, is that in contract, statutory, and even state constitutional cases, it's more plausible to devote some kinds of considerations to provide incentives for a clearer legal product in the future. In contracts, the parole evidence rule and the plain meaning rule are strict rules that provide and create incentives for parties to specify terms clearly. Contra preferentum in insurance contracts should lead insurers to make terms clearer for less sophisticated parties. Demoting legislative history to a tiebreaker as well may reduce strategic behavior by legislatures and encourage more transparency in statutes. In short, when considering decision costs, structures for decisions should consider dynamic future effects in reducing decision costs by changing the behavior of lawmakers or citizens. Given that many statutes and contracts that will be written in the future, courts have reasons to be concerned with such incentive effects. But the federal Constitution has been rarely amended and has not now been amended for over a half century. Even state constitutions are much more frequently rewritten than our fundamental federal law. In any event, I want to simply end by thanking the organizers for asking me to comment on this very stimulating paper.
Okay, thank you, John. Adam, you have a few minutes if you want to respond to that.
Yeah, great. So I agree with much of what John said. Let me take up the last couple of points first. It's true that in other areas, forward-looking incentive effects are more pertinent, probably than in federal constitutional law. However, we don't need a tie-breaking structure to generate incentives one way or another. We can do that with weighting different considerations, or even more starkly, excluding them outright. So while it's true that there is a difference there, I don't think it's a difference that's especially pertinent to choosing across these particular structures. And then stakes, once again, yep, that's right. Higher stakes, probably, for many constitutional questions, federal constitutional questions in particular, that helps separate out some of the other domains. But here the trick would be connecting that up to a tie-breaking structure instead of a structure of weights or excluding certain considerations altogether as opposed to including them all. A point I want to, I guess, emphatically agree with is the idea that you can achieve decisiveness, at least on certain assumptions, with more considerations rather than fewer. And so the inclusive mix approach, at least on certain, I think, plausible assumptions, will tend to be more decisive than an exclusive mix with fewer sources. But on some plausible assumptions, and depending on what you put in a lower tier, you'll get maybe 100% decisiveness with a tie-breaking structure. But I basically want to agree with the proposition, though, that at least on assumptions I think are plausible, more information is not going to tend toward more uncertainty, even if it might tend toward stronger disagreements. Okay, and then on the Supreme Court now and the stability, and maybe we might see a tie-breaking structure hierarchy emerge in the future. I'm especially curious about what will happen, say, in the next couple of years if Roe is overruled, for example, Grutter and Gratz and so forth. So if this is a pivot point for constitutional doctrine of the U.S. Supreme Court, it might alleviate some of the explanations or the pressures to not formally endorse a position of text plus history or some range of sources with precedent in a lower tier. If they knock out a number of the precedents where it was uncomfortable to be clear on whether those were jeopardized or not. So that's something that it'd be a way of testing one kind of explanation for why we see the absence of a hierarchy explicitly endorsed in much of federal constitutional law. And then I agree that there are some patches in federal constitutional law where there's some hierarchy. It's certainly possible we could get a move in that direction. One last quick point, we can open it up for more questions, is on policy, I think that's an anti-modality now in federal constitutional law. I would never put in a brief as a practicing lawyer now, Part 3 policy arguments. I would not do that in a constitutional case. In a few state courts in their state constitutional law regimes, and for some state statutory interpretation, that's still conventional and accepted. But I think for federal constitutional law, it had better be a policy that someone else endorsed or think it's a good idea, not the judges you're pitching to. So I think that's another one of those instances where the source starts to get more normatively problematic over time, and then probably ends up dropping out of the range of acceptable sources rather than being demoted.